Madison Square Garden, downtown New York City, New York. They don't call it the world's most famous arena for no reason. This venue has played host to some of the largest sporting and pop culture events throughout the history of entertainment, and that does include numerous Ultimate Fighting Championship events as well that began back on November 12th of 2016 after the sport of mixed martial arts and the UFC as an organization was banned in the entire state for over 21 years, dating back to September 1995. And so it only made sense that after that ban was lifted and the UFC could reinsert itself into the state and into the Garden in downtown New York City, that they would put on an absolute blockbuster event year after year, and they have done so for 9 straight at this point. And it all began with UFC 205, as we would see 3 championship bouts that included Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz, Tyrone Woodley versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and in the main event we would see Eddie Alvarez taking on Conor McGregor in his pursuit to become the first ever simultaneous double champ in the organization's history, and that is exactly what he did, marking the first monumental evening that the UFC would ever have in the world's most famous arena. And that night would mark the annual tradition for the UFC to head back to this arena and put on absolutely massive events. At UFC 217, we would see the return of one of the greatest fighters of all time, Georges St-Pierre, after a 4-year hiatus, come back up a weight class at middleweight and dethrone Michael Bisping to become a 2-weight world champion. And we would also see TJ Dillashaw dethrone Cody Garbrandt in the first of their 2-bout rivalry, and Rose Namajunas shocked the world by knocking out Joanna Jędrzejczyk and ending her reign of terror in the strawweight division. 3 title fights, 3 new champions in the same evening. Daniel Cormier at UFC 230 would defend his heavyweight championship for the first and only time after dethroning the greatest heavyweight of all time, Stipe Miocic, just a few months prior in July of 2018. At UFC 244, we would see Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz compete in the first ever BMF championship bout, where Masvidal would get the belt wrapped around his waist by none other than The Rock. At UFC 268 in 2021, Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington would settle their rivalry in their second bout, where Usman would remain the champion. We would see Rose Namajunas move to 2-0 in Madison Square Garden and against Zhang Weili in their second bout to remain the strawweight champion, and we would see Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler compete in one of the greatest fights of 2021 and arguably the greatest UFC fight that has ever taken place in that venue. At UFC 281, we would see Alex Pereira knock out Israel Adesanya to become the middleweight champion of the world, and we've seen all of the greatness that he has gone on to accomplish since that evening. We would see Zhang Weili become the strawweight champion for the second time by submitting Carla Esparza, and we would see Dustin Poirier and Michael Chandler go toe-to-toe in a bloody back-and-forth scrap. 1 year later, at UFC 295, Alex Pereira would headline Madison Square Garden for back-to-back years. This time, he would become a champion again, and at a new weight class of light heavyweight by knocking out Jiri Prochazka, and we would see Tom Aspinall and Sergey Pavlovich step into the cage on 2 weeks' notice for the interim championship in the heavyweight division, and Tom Aspinall would knock out Sergey Pavlovich, who at that point was on a 6-fight first-round knockout win streak and was one of the most terrifying heavyweights on the planet, and Tom Aspinall made it look easy. At UFC 309 last year, we would see one of the biggest legacy fights that the UFC has ever had, as we would see John Jones, the greatest fighter of all time, take on Stipe Miocic, the greatest heavyweight of all time, and John Jones would get the TKO finish to continue cementing himself as the GOAT. And now all roads lead to UFC 322, as the UFC is back in New York City once again, back in Madison Square Garden. And so to no one's surprise, we have another absolutely jam-packed card from top to bottom. And the headlining spot belongs to Jack Della Maddalena, the welterweight champion of the world, defending his title for the first time against Islam Makhachev, the greatest lightweight in UFC history. And this isn't any ordinary welterweight championship fight, because as just noted, Islam Makhachev is the greatest lightweight of all time, but now he is moving up to 170 pounds after vacating his title in the summer in an attempt to chase greatness and become a 2-weight world champion and join a very selective list of elite fighters throughout the company's 32-year history. And it is a battle of 2 top 10 pound-for-pound fighters, as Islam Makhachev will enter this fight sitting at number 2 pound-for-pound, and Jack Della Maddalena, the newly crowned welterweight champ, sits at number 8. These two will enter the UFC 322 main event on a combined 33-fight win streak. Yes, I didn't stutter. 33. Jack Della Maddalena started his professional mixed martial arts career 0-2 and hasn't looked back since, has tallied off 18 consecutive victories. And while Islam Makhachev didn't begin his professional mixed martial arts career 0-2, he did begin his UFC career 0-1 with a knockout loss, but since then has won 15 consecutive fights in his own right, and as a matter of fact sits tied with Kamaru Usman at number 2 for the longest win streaks in UFC history, tailing only behind one man, my favorite fighter of all time, Anderson the Spider Silva. So Islam Makhachev not only has the opportunity to become the welterweight champion of the world, but he has the opportunity to become a 2-weight world champion, and he has the opportunity to tie Anderson Silva, one of the greatest fighters of all time in mixed martial arts, for the longest win streak in the UFC's history at 16. Islam Makhachev also holds the 4th most lightweight victories of all time with 15, tied with numerous other lightweight legends, the 5th most finishes in lightweight history, the 2nd most submissions in lightweight history, the longest win streak at 155 pounds with 14 in a row, and the most title fight victories ever at lightweight with 5, even surpassing his mentor Khabib Nurmagomedov. And so with those accolades and the resume that he has stacked up, especially over the last 5 years, I think it's safe to say that it's not even an argument at this point. He is the greatest lightweight of all time, and if he comes in here and beats Jack Della Maddalena to become the welterweight champion, become a 2-weight world champion, tie Anderson Silva's all-time win streak, he immediately will insert himself into the top 10 greatest fighter of all time category, regardless of weight class, if you ask me. But Jackie Moon, as I like to call him, Jack Della Maddalena, has the opportunity to play spoiler and put an end to all of those insane accolades that I just listed off for Islam Makhachev, and in the same breath defend his welterweight championship for the first time and extend his own win streak to 19 in a row and improve to 9-0 in the UFC since debuting back in January of 2022 following his Dana White Contender Series stint in the fall of 2021. And JDM is no stranger to ending insane win streaks as well, because in order to become the welterweight champion of the world, which he did back in May at UFC 315, he would have to take out Belal Muhammad, who entering that fight was on an 11-fight unbeaten streak, after becoming the champion at UFC 304 in the summer of 2024 by defeating Leon Edwards, who in his own right was on an insane unbeaten streak. For Jack Della Maddalena, he came out of the gates blazing hot with 4 consecutive first-round finishes to start off his UFC career, and had 3 fights in each of 2022 and 2023, which would quickly allow him to rise up the welterweight rankings and catapulting himself into a big-time matchup against Gilbert Burns in March of 2024 at UFC 299. And there we would see Jack Della Maddalena be battle-tested more than we had ever seen before, and he was on the brink of defeat before having one of the greatest comebacks in welterweight history and the comeback of the year officially in 2024, and he did so by knocking out Gilbert Burns with just 1 minute and 17 seconds remaining in their bout, and that was enough to earn him a crack at Belal Muhammad's throne a little over 1 year later in May of this year at UFC 315, where he would pick up the 25-minute unanimous decision win over Muhammad, who at that point had looked borderline unstoppable at 170. And there at UFC 315, we would see Jack Della Maddalena utilize his crisp boxing technical skills to outpoint and outstrike Belal Muhammad en route to the unanimous decision victory, while also stuffing 6 out of 9 takedown attempts from Belal Muhammad and only giving up 3 minutes and 20 seconds of control time. And I think there's no better fight to prepare Jack Della Maddalena for Islam Makhachev than Belal Muhammad, who is essentially the welterweight version of Islam to a certain extent at least, because both of them are known for their insane pressure and pace, specifically in the grappling and wrestling realm, taking their opponents down at will, controlling them up against the fence, and draining the will out of them from minute 1 to minute 25 or less, depending on their finishing prowess. But the keywords there are finishing prowess, because that is something that Islam Makhachev holds in a much higher regard than Belal Muhammad. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, it's just the simple fact of the matter. Because Islam Makhachev has finished 10 of his 15 UFC victories, and in his specific championship era has finished 4 out of his 5 title fights. And the resume that Islam Makhachev has stacked together since April of 2019 is quite astonishing, with wins including Arman Tsarukyan, Drew Dober, Thiago Moises, Bobby Green, Charles Oliveira, Alexander Volkanovski not once but twice, with the second coming by devastating knockout, and back-to-back submission wins over Dustin Poirier and Renato Moicano back in January at UFC 311, Islam Makhachev's most recent bout, where he was supposed to take on Arman Tsarukyan in a rematch, but Arman would have to pull out due to a back injury the day before the fight on Friday, which would then force Renato Moicano to step in on 1 day's notice, and Islam Makhachev said yes anyway and disposed of him in the very first round. And then he would give his belt up in the summer, allowing Charles Oliveira and Ilia Topuria to fight for that vacated strap at UFC 317 International Fight Week at the end of June, where we would see Ilia Topuria knock out Charles Oliveira in the first round to become the new champion, freeing up Islam Makhachev to chase this goal of dethroning Jack Della Maddalena to achieve greatness and become a champion in 2 separate weight classes. And arguably the 2 most stacked weight classes, at least present day right now in the UFC, for what it's worth. So how will Islam Makhachev fill out? How will he look physically up at 170 pounds? Because it is stated that he is walking around right now at 191 pounds. And so I think it's safe to say that these two are going to look pretty similar in terms of stature, as Jack Della Maddalena only has a 1-inch height advantage and a 2.5-inch reach advantage. And just looking at Jack Della Maddalena's first 8 UFC bouts, it's not like he's the biggest 170 pounder in the world. And so physically, if Islam Makhachev can check all of the boxes and look similar to the champion Jack Della Maddalena, how will his actual strengths inside of the cage transition to 170 pounds? Will he be able to have the grappling and wrestling success that he has had back at 155 pounds against Jack Della Maddalena, who looked incredible in terms of a takedown defense standpoint in that bout a few months ago against Bilal Muhammad, and overall does hold a 69% takedown defense rate? Because if JDM can keep this fight standing, or even show the ability to get back up after being taken down by Islam Makhachev, things all of a sudden become very intriguing. Because Jack Della Maddalena is held in high regard when it comes to his boxing, some people even saying that he is the best, most technical boxer in the entire organization. And so while yes, Islam Makhachev has grown leaps and bounds in the striking realm, and in my opinion is far ahead of his mentor in Khabib Nurmagomedov ever was in the striking, I think it's safe to say that he can't necessarily compete blow for blow, strike for strike against Jack Della Maddalena, especially up at 170 pounds. Because yes, we saw him go toe-to-toe with Dustin Poirier in their bout last summer, but with this 15-pound weight discrepancy and the accuracy and power that JDM possesses, I think it's a whole different ballgame. But if Islam can come in here and get Jack Della Maddalena down at will and hold him down specifically utilizing his ground and pound and submission techniques, this is an opportunity for him to again insert himself into the greatest of all time discussions and achieve something that a very small amount of fighters throughout the UFC's history has been able to do, and that is hold 2 belts in 2 separate weight classes. This fight truly checks every single box imaginable, especially for a bout at the top of the bill in Madison Square Garden, downtown New York, New York. Gold on the line, legacy on the line, win streaks and accolades on the line. There's nothing that this fight doesn't check off for the ultimate mixed martial arts fan and the casual viewer as well. Will Jack Della Maddalena retain his welterweight championship? Will he extend his perfect UFC record to 9-0? Will he extend his overall win streak to 19 in a row? Or will Islam Makhachev make history, become a 2-weight world champion, tie Anderson Silva for the longest win streak in UFC history, and insert himself into the top 10 of the greatest fighters of all time? It's time for you to sound off down in the comments below. Give me your predictions, give me your bets, and give all of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this UFC 322 main event breakdown, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, as we are on the road to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and the goal is to reach that milestone before the end of 2025, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. Alongside breakdowns of the biggest and best fights and storylines heading into each card, I also recap the most meaningful results in the aftermath and give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. You can also join the discussion on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Monday and Friday podcast episodes are released there. Have a great weekend, enjoy this monumental fight card, and I will see you all in the next video.